We are starting a new sermon series this morning. I think it's going to be a really cool sermon series, and it's just called The Exodus. And we're going to be looking at choosing God over pleasure, and we're going to be looking at it through the eyes of Moses. And what we're going to be doing is looking at the process that Moses went through in the early parts of his life, escaping the trappings of this world and becoming a productive worker for the kingdom of God. And we're just going to walk through, in the month of August, his life leading up through him, leading the people out, the Exodus, leading them out of Egypt into the Promised Land, and learning some lessons about his life that we can apply to our life to go, how do we transition from being a person of the world to a person working in God's kingdom? So that's what we're going to look at. This morning, we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2 of Exodus. So if you have your Bibles with you or on your phone, you can pull those out. But we're going to be going through the first two chapters and the first part of this process of becoming a kingdom worker and looking at what was the first thing that Moses had to do. And we're going to jump right in, chapter 1. Let me give you a little background on chapter 1 as you get into the book of Exodus. Here's what's happened. Joseph, if you know the story, if you remember the story, Joseph, he's the one that has the 11 brothers that sell him into slavery, and through all different events and all, he becomes like the second in command in Egypt. At the end of that story in his life, after he saves his brothers from the famine, he moves their whole family to Egypt. Over the next 70 years, after Joseph moves his family to Egypt, this is the Hebrew people, the beginning of the Israelites. They live in the land of Egypt for 70 years while Joseph still lives, and it says they multiply, and they actually become a fairly powerful group of people within Egypt. After the 70 years, Joseph passes away. So do several of the Egyptian pharaohs who were there when Joseph came into power. And what happens is this is kind of the history of the Israelites is forgotten in Egypt, and people start to see them not as people who came to save us, but people that are a threat within our kingdom now, okay? That's how Exodus chapter 1 starts off when you're getting into it. And we're going to jump into verses 8 through 14. And here's what it reads. It says, "Eventually a new king came into power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, 'Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us, and they are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, if a war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from our country.' So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in their demands. Now, as you carry on, even with them treating them horribly and turning them into slaves, it says they continue to grow in number. And the concern continues to rise within the Egyptians. So the next thing the Pharaoh does is he grabs what are called the midwives. They were the ladies that helped deliver babies. And basically he put word out to the midwives, which is this. When you are delivering babies, if they are having a male baby, you kill them. Kill them when they come out and just say the baby was dead when it came out. So he gives the order to all the midwives, when you're delivering the Hebrew babies, you kill them at birth. It says this, it says the midwives fear God, and they basically refuse to do it. And Pharaoh eventually calls them in and goes, "What's going on? They're still growing. I'm not hearing of a bunch of dead baby boys. What's going on?" And they say, "You know what? The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. When they're ready to give birth, they're like popped out like that, and we can't get there in time. And there's nothing we can do. And the moms already know they're alive, so we can't kill them." That's the actual story. So Pharaoh at this point obviously knows he's being played with. He goes, "Okay, we won't do this as a covert mission. What we're going to do is this. We're just going to do this out in the open, which is every male baby we see, we grab them and we throw them in the Nile River." Okay, so this is how we're going to get population control. If you see a male baby, you grab them and you throw them in the river and you let them drown. This is how we're going to control the Hebrews from multiplying and continuing to grow in power. That is the situation that Moses is born into. all right? As they now are people who have been enslaved, and they are now having all their young killed and thrown into the river and drowned. And this is where Moses enters the picture. We get into chapter 2, and here's what it reads at the beginning of chapter 2. It says, "About this time, a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months." So, knowing what's happening, she somehow hid her pregnancy and hid the birth of her child for the first 3 months of his life, was able to hide him in the house somehow, where the Egyptians did not find out that they had a baby boy at home, all right? It says, "But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reed and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him." So it says the mom, after 3 months, realizes, I can't hide him anymore. People are going to find out. So she, as a mother, can you imagine having to do this? She, as a mother, makes up a basket, puts her baby in it, and instead of just having him thrown in the river, knowing he dies, I'll at least give the chance to see what happens, and I'll float him down the river and see if something else can happen, if his fate can be different. So she lays him in the river, and it says his sister kind of watches on the shore to see what happens. Next part of the story we see is this. As he ends up floating down to where the Pharaoh's daughter is bathing, and he gets kind of stuck over in like the marshy weeds on the side of the river. She comes out, she's bathing in the river, and it says that she hears a crying baby. She sends her servants over, they find a basket, and they find this little baby, and it says she sees the baby, and she wants it as her own, and decides to adopt it, and she looks for someone to nurse the baby until he gets older, and that's where his sister comes into play. And his sister comes over and goes, "Would you like me to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this child to maturity," or whatever? And she says, "Absolutely." So the sister goes home and grabs who? His mom. So his mom, Moses' mom, gets him back, and what happens is she actually gets paid. We know from how the Egyptian system worked, she gets actually paid to care for this child for the first 3 years of his life and nurse him until he's weaned. So for 3 years, she gets paid to raise her own son when every other kid's being thrown in the Nile River and drowned to death. Then it says after 3 years that she returns the son to Pharaoh's daughter, and at that point she officially adopts Moses and gives him the name Moses at that point when he's 3 years old. And it's at this point he is actually a prince of Egypt. He is the daughter's son of Pharaoh. He is, how many of you saw that old cartoon, the movie, The Prince of Egypt? That's where the name comes from, okay? He was a prince of Egypt at this point with access to all the benefits that included. They are the most powerful nation on the earth. This is the height of their power, and he now is a prince within the kingdom. Here's what I found amazing about this first part, though, is this. Before the Israelite people even started to call out to God, at this point, they haven't even called out to God while they're in their bondage and slavery. Before they even cry out to God, what you have is God has already started a rescue plan for them. God has already put something in place to rescue them down the road. We know this from the rest of the story. It wasn't until Moses was 80 years old, so 80 years from his birth, that Moses is used by God at that point to rescue the Israelites and answer their prayers when they start calling out to God to go, "God, rescue us." But we know 80 years before that, God is already putting the plan in place before these people even know they need a plan. And here's what I learned from that is this. In our lives, God has already put things in place to answer prayers that we have not yet even prayed. And there are things that he's putting in motion now to meet our needs and our concerns down the road. Jesus says this in Matthew 6, verse 8. He says, "For your Father knows exactly what you need even before you ask him." Your Father knows what you need even before you ask him. So when you think that God isn't listening to you, when you feel like God is not aware of the circumstances in your life, what I want to ask you to do is this: be patient. Be patient with him. You see, God's got a plan that he might already have in works for years before you even knew that you needed a solution to that prayer. God is already aware of it, and he's already working circumstances to be that answer. So when things are tough, when you just need someone to encourage you, when you're going, "My life is melting down on me," what I want to encourage you again is this: wait for God's solution. Be patient with him. He is well aware of your needs. He knew them long before you even knew that you needed a solution to be put in place, and he will reveal that solution to you in his perfect timing. He always does. Those of you that have been Christians longer, you know this, is you will pray for things, and you're asking, why God, are you not answering this? Why isn't it coming true? And then all of a sudden, you see kind of the answer be revealed, and you see it work out, and you sit there and you marvel, and I always say this to myself, God knows the right timing. God knew just when I needed to answer it this way, and I'm glad he didn't answer it this way up to now. And a lot of those times, I can look back in my life, and I can see like 15 other steps that happened in my life and things that happened around here where before I even knew I needed God, he was already preparing a solution. How many of you had experienced that in your life? Okay? That's God. We see that with Moses. That's something that we see time and time again in the scriptures is before you even pray it, God might have been working for 80 years preparing a solution for you before you even knew you needed a solution. That's the first thing I see in the story that amazes me. Go on to chapter 2. The story kind of jumps forward really quick after this as you have him being adopted. He's now a prince of Egypt, and then it jumps ahead about, 35 years. Okay? And here's where it says in verse 11 of chapter 2, it says, many years later, we know this at this point, Moses is 40. So you're talking about 35 years later from where it cuts off in chapter 1. Verse 11 of chapter 2, now he's 40. It says, many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian, or sometimes it's referred to as the wilderness of Midian. Okay? So when he's 40, he is out walking along, and he sees some Hebrew being beat up by an Egyptian slave driver, goes over, makes sure no one sees, and he kills the guy, beats him to death. Kills the guy and hides his body. Then the next day, he sees 2 of his brothers, 2 Hebrew guys, fight in, and he says, why are you beating that guy up? And he says, who made you my judge? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And he realizes at that point, when word gets out that I've killed an Egyptian, I'm a dead man. And it says, sure enough, Pharaoh finds out, and he basically runs away because he knows he's going to be killed. Now, if I was his friend at the time, I would have told him, hey, Moses, stick around, let them kill you, because going to the wilderness and sleeping in a tent for the next 40 years ain't worth it, dude. Just die now, because it could be worse. Thank God Moses didn't have me as his friend at the time, okay? Because that would have been my advice to him is, you know what I did last weekend? I did exactly what you're thinking of doing. Don't do it. Don't do it. But anyways, he runs off into the wilderness. And here's the next thing I see that's very interesting in the story in chapter 2 is this. We see somewhere Moses made a choice. And Moses made a choice at some point in his life to choose God over the pleasures of this world. When you look at that scripture there in chapter 2, it says multiple times, some phrase like this. It says, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews. It says that multiple times. Now understand, he was adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter. He is a prince of Egypt. By the time he is 40, he now identifies himself with the Hebrew slaves rather than the Egyptian royal family. Somewhere he has made the choice at this point to go, you know what? I'm going to identify myself with the Hebrews rather than the Egyptian people. And we don't know where that process happened, but somewhere between the ages of 5 and 40, he went, these are my people, not these people. And what that meant is this. He was going to be associated with lowly slaves rather than the prestige of royalty. And that's a tough choice to make. Think about it. If you grow up in absolute wealth, how many people go, I choose to identify with those in poverty? If you grow up in absolute authority and power, how many people give that up and go, I choose to be identified with slaves, with people who have no prestige, that have no authority? Moses, somewhere along his path, made that decision. Hebrews chapter 11, it kind of gives us a better insight into this. Here's what it reads. It says, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, the author of Hebrews says this: when he grew up, he refused to be known as a prince of Egypt. He refused, even though he had every right to be. He refused to be known as a prince of Egypt. He chose to share in the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. What I have to assume happened was this: someday in Moses' life, in his teens or his early 20s or whatever, said this: you know what? I'm tired of being with these Egyptian people, and these are my people, and these are God's people, and I'm going to be identified with them, and I'm giving this up. And my assumption would be this: Pharaoh basically at some point probably went, that's fine, we won't touch you, but we don't like you anymore. And when Pharaoh heard he had killed an Egyptian, probably went, this is my ticket to kill him. This is my ticket to get rid of him. This is just my opinion on this. But looking at those scriptures, you have Moses at some point going, I don't want anything of this royal family. These are my people, and I will associate with the slaves. They are my people. They are my family. They're God's people. And I will not associate with this pagan lifestyle. I will not associate with your pagan gods. I will be with God's people, whether they are slaves or whether they are royalty. They are the people I will stick with. Okay? You see, here's the thing. Every one of us at some point in our lives is just like Moses. It is going to be a place where we are faced with who do we identify with. We are all going to face that day where who do I identify with? Are you going to identify with the world and all of its pleasures? Are you willing to be identified with Jesus? And you have to make a choice. And let me tell you what, it's not an easy choice. We live in a culture where we live like kings. We live in a culture where we live as if we have wealth coming out of our ears. You remember a couple weeks ago we talked about this in comparison to the rest of the world. The lives we live as if we are princes of Egypt. But God goes, I want you to choose me. And that doesn't always mean in our society that we will be poor, that we will be slaves, but it does mean to some extent we will be outcast and we will be different. And we will not have the praises that the world lavishes on everyone else. We will be separate, and we will be seen as outsiders to a large extent in our culture. And just like Moses at some point in his life had to go, I got to pick a side. We as believers, we as individuals, we have to pick a side. Who will you be identified with? Will you choose the pleasures of this world that make it really easy? You can live a very comfortable life, and you can live a life where the world will cheer you on no matter what decisions you make in your life. And you can have all the pleasures of the world. Or will you choose Jesus, which is a different path? It's a much different path. Who are you going to identify with? Jesus says this in Luke chapter 6. He says, what blessings await you when people hate you and exclude you and mock you and curse you as evil because you follow the Son of Man. When that happens, he says this, be happy. Yes, leap for joy, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. Okay? Jesus warns us, if you're going to follow me, the world's not going to accept you. You're not going to have all the pleasures of the world. It's not going to accept you all the time because I'm going to ask you to make different choices in your life. I'm going to ask you to be a kingdom worker, and that's going to require you making some different choices than what the world does out there. And when you do that, they're not always going to be happy with you. And that's going to lead to some persecution. That's going to lean to some people not being really happy with you on a daily basis and possibly mocking and other types of persecution you might face. And Jesus says this, it's very interesting. He says, when that happens, be happy. He says, yes, leap for joy, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. So he says, when that happens to you for living the lifestyle I call you to live, be happy about it. Leap for joy because you know you're doing the thing God has called you to do, and you know that God will reward you someday in heaven. You see, every great kingdom worker starts with having to make the same decision Moses did, which is this: will you choose God or will you choose pleasure? One leads to eternal success, the other one leads to eternal failure. And we have to make a choice. Which path will we choose? To do incredible kingdom work, which should be the goal of Christians, which is this. What that means is this: the life you live accomplishes eternal results in people's lives around you. That's what being a kingdom worker is. It's accomplishing eternal things of God in a temporary environment. All right? If you're not a kingdom worker, what it means is you are living in a temporary, and you're only accomplishing temporary things that will go to the grave with you. And every one of us will be a great kingdom worker. The first place it starts is this: will you choose to be associated with God, or will you choose to be associated with the worldly pleasures that this place offers you? My question for you this morning is this: what choice have you made? What choice have you made? If you're not a believer in here, it's pretty easy to identify what choice you've made to this point. Here's the struggle. Christians, a lot of us give our lives to Christ, but then the world starts to grab at us. And the world starts to drag us back in. And at some point, you still have to answer the question, what choice have you made? Are you identifying your life with Jesus? Are you identifying your life with the pleasures of this world? I hope you choose well, because what we'll see in the coming weeks is this: when you choose right to be associated with Jesus Christ, God can do incredible things in your life. Moses was not anything unique. He's just a man who chose to follow God, and through that, God answered the prayers of many. And you can be one of those people too by choosing right and choosing to be a kingdom worker. God can use you to change the lives of many. And we will see that in the coming weeks. But it all starts with making a choice of who you will be associated with, God or pleasure. Would you pray with me?